Lit student, it is I, Mr. Hahn, defeating the weather through the power of technology. You're watching this video, I trust, on YouTube after I upload it, so that you can keep caught up on the class syllabus with our review of The Invisible Man and continuing some work on the writing project. I think it's really quite fitting, if there is a day to miss school, it is quite fitting that it would be this particular class, because it really fits the theme, don't you think? You, after all, can't see me. Or can you? Yes, I think that's really quite a rich field of irony there. I'll give you a moment to groan, as you would if you were in class with me. All right, so continuing. We speak to a theme of science fiction and technology in this presentation, The Invisible Man, What Does He Show Us? And I think that's also quite appropriate. Here I am using a video camera and its onboard microphone to record a kind of video cast. That would not have been possible back when I was teaching full-time, I'll tell you that. Things do change quite quickly. The internet, the casual way in which we can throw these megabytes of information around the internet is amazing. And I'll try to keep this as brief as I can. There's obviously a lot of things that we really need to do in class. That remains kind of irreplaceable, but we'll try to catch up on those in succeeding weeks. For today, you were to have done the lit guide on Scarlet Pimpernel and hand it in. I was hoping you'd keep your hand in on your writing, and we'll talk about that a little bit later at the end of this presentation. So today, I want to introduce you to the times and the author and the work known as The Invisible Man by H.G. Wells. And here I have a quote from way back at Plato's Republic, a work written back in the 5th century BC about the nature of justice. And I wonder why that would have a bearing on today's class. Plato's Republic, Socrates is supposed to have said, "For all men believe in their hearts that injustice is far more profitable to the individual than justice." Injustice is more profitable to the individual than justice? Do you actually believe that? Do you think most people believe that? What is justice anyway, and why does that have anything to do with a ripping good science fiction story? Because that's what Invisible Man is. So let's see what the Invisible Man can show us. Pause for groan there. I am here but not here, your host, Mr. Hahn. It is one of the early works of science fiction, which really blossomed at some time around this period. People dispute when science fiction as a genre came into being. I've heard some people argue quite well that the first work of science fiction is probably from a century before Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. But it's interesting to see what movies and television have done with that theme, and they alter these themes as well, these early works. They often change it when they get into TV and the movies, and I can tell you, if you haven't read Frankenstein, it's a very different story than what you would expect. You know, all those big throw levers and the lightning bolt and the electricity going pop, fizzle, and the thing going vzz-rap in between the two tubes. None of that is in Mary Shelley's story. She was writing in the mid-1700s. There was no real advancement of electricity or anything like that at the time. And her story was really much more of a horror tale as it was told. But you could see it as a work of science fiction, even in its original form. And one of the points I want to make to you is, nobody knew what science fiction was as a category when they were just starting to write it. That isn't what H.G. Wells or Jules Verne or Edgar Rice Burroughs, that isn't what they thought when they began to write these stories. They were just writing far-out tales, things that were amazing, things that spoke to, I guess, impossible things, pushing back the definition of possible, because that's what was happening in their real world at the time. If you think about the period, say, 1850 to the outbreak of World War I, 1914, in that 50, 60-year period, so many things increased or got much more powerful. Transportation with the steam engine and then the car, early airplanes by the time World War I broke out, medicine advances, inoculation becoming widespread, the beginnings of the use of antibiotics with penicillin, x-rays, all of these things, skyscrapers in buildings, enormous empires being established around the world and pulled together with machines, lots and lots of machines, and even mundane things like maybe elevators, right? How can you have a 30-story building if everybody's got to climb all those stairs? Elevators are actually one of the things that contribute to the growth of all this in the world. So the definition of what was possible and impossible was changing all the time in the real world. And some writers, like H.G. Wells, were constantly pushing back the boundary even beyond that, and talking about things that really seemed out of all possibility. If they were ever going to happen, it would have to be in the far future. So he wrote about From the Earth to the Moon in 1865, which is 100 years before it actually happened. And notice he got some things right. Here's a drawing from one of the original versions. They understood that the rocket would need to be in stages. They didn't understand that it needed to be a rocket, actually. This is more of a bullet. It was fired from a gun once, and the separate stages, I'm not exactly sure why they were there, but they did seem to understand that even back then. And of course, the time machine, which is one of his more famous stories, coming out in 1895, the idea of being able to travel through time. So science fiction is, as it came to be defined later, was a set of works that talked about things that were, to the readers, impossible. And they weren't always set in the future. They weren't always about future people, but they were future-oriented, futuristic. They tended to look ahead and often had a focus on technology, items or devices or inventions or techniques that weren't around but could possibly one day be around, like traveling to the moon. Time machine still ahead of us, I think. People still saying that's impossible, and I have to believe them. But very much out of the ordinary, very much far out writing. And so in bookshelves you see sci-fi and fantasy put together. Think about that, right? Fantasy is another way of looking at what's far out. It's just so far beyond what we can see in our daily lives. And sci-fi and fantasy both raise the same question. Have things changed so much that the rules are different? Are men and women actually relating to each other differently? Have their lives really changed because of this incredible new thing that's happening, whether it's magic, whether it's technology? Here's a quote by Arthur C. Clarke from the middle of our century, I should say the 20th century. Arthur C. Clarke was a great science fiction writer, wrote 2001: A Space Odyssey and others. And he has the famous saying, any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. So as you can see, booksellers had an idea that these types of tales belong together. But again, back then, when Jules Verne and H.G. Wells and Burroughs and all those guys were writing, they didn't think of it as science fiction. In fact, the story that we're looking at these next couple of weeks, The Invisible Man, H.G. Wells originally described that as a grotesque romance. A grotesque romance. What the heck does that mean? It really leads you in the wrong direction, right? I think grotesque romance, like, okay, ugly boy meets girl, ugly boy loses. No, that's not at all. There's no love story at all in the story. It's really a romance in the sense of an adventure. And it's grotesque in the way that it's going to kind of poke at you. It's going to poke at you to think about whether this gruesome thing could actually happen. It is actually a gruesome thing. So if you want to argue that The Invisible Man is a horror story, I'm not going to give you a real tough time. That's certainly the way that the later movies and television treatments have treated it for the most part. It's as a horror. There's an element of horror in this grotesque romance. Herbert George Wells, not a very exciting name, sounds much better actually as H.G. Wells, was born just after the American Civil War in England and lived until just after the end of World War II. Think about all the things that changed in that period of time. Weapons, medicine, transportation, buildings and society in general, inventions. Think of all the things that changed in just the course of his lifetime. He was of modest background, a working class family, not rich by any means. There was a question of whether he could continue to go to school at times, but he wasn't, shall we say, poor as the Dickens. A little literary humor there. I'll give you another pause for a groan. Yeah, he wasn't as poor as Charles Dickens and the workhouses and things like that. There was always a question of going to school, getting a job. He broke his leg when he was 8 years old, and that's a very serious thing, in 1874, and laid up for weeks and weeks. He began a lifelong habit of reading voraciously. He read everything. And at one point in his life, he kept a job he didn't otherwise like because it allowed him the use of a library. It was a teaching job. Imagine not liking a teaching job. But he kept it because it allowed him the use of a large library and he could continue reading. So that was an important motivating force in his life to be able to read. He trained first in science, in biology, and you will see undertones of his knowledge of biology in this work, in Invisible Man, and in other things that he wrote. There was a constant theme of biology. So we look at science fiction oftentimes from a technology perspective, an engineer, a mechanical engineer, or somebody who's inventing something. And there are inventions in his works. He was a well-read person, but you'll hear an echo of biology. And again, what happens to the person, what happens to the being, was constantly his concern, and one that I want to draw to your attention here. He did work as a teacher for several years when it was necessary to make money. Imagine taking a job as a teacher to make money. And he at times worked as a journalist and wrote many articles and even books and tracts about the alleged real world. He didn't just dedicate himself to a life as a novelist. To him, the two things often went together. And he was the writer of many, many stories that are so seminal, so original for their time. In the period of the 1880s, 90s, and early 1900s, he wrote so many stories whose themes I think you would recognize and have been picked up on and used over and over again in popular media. They really owe their roots to him, right? War of the Worlds, about an alien invasion from Mars with, superior technology from the Martians. What are we going to do? That comes right down to Independence Day or Mars Attacks. You can see that. This is the forebearer of all those kinds of stories. The Time Machine. Will we ever gain the ability to move through time? And what does that mean for us? Can we only move forward in time? Can we move back? Can we change the past? That's an enormous question, right? And again, I draw your mind back. I want you to think about the theme of what science fiction under Wells and others, what they were looking at. Does it really change the rules? Supposing we could go back in time, right? Could you go back to, I don't know, to 1912 when Hitler was about, 10 years old and shoot him? Could you just shoot Hitler? And would that change everything? That's the kind of thing that he wants to draw your mind to. Of course, the Invisible Man. What would it mean if you personally could become invisible? And the Island of Dr. Moreau, where we really attack this question of the difference between beings, human beings and animals, the soul, the ethics, the morals of a human being. Here's a doctor who's experimenting on animals and kind of lifting them up and making them much, much more human in their ability to stand straight and giving them hands and speech. Does that make them human? What does it make the doctor? What does it make Dr. Moreau that he's doing these things? Right? He explores these kinds of moral questions all the time, which I think is very exciting. He always wanted to think about what was the impact of these new ideas. How was it going to change? Would it change at all the rules? And in a fantasy work, if I may say so, it's the same thing. You have a magic sword instead of a phaser. You have gorgeous mithril armor instead of Kevlar or something very futuristic. You have a dragon to ride on instead of a spaceship. But do the rules change? Are you a hero? Are you a villain? And this gets back to your writing exercise as well. What are you going to do? Really, whatever setting you find yourself in, what are you going to do? So Wells's writing was very future-oriented. He was always thinking about the impact of the shape of what society would be like in the future. And something he wrote that wasn't a fiction work. It was a kind of political tract with a very long title, Anticipations of the Reaction of Mechanical and Scientific Progress upon Human Life and Thought. He wrote it in 1901, and he said, let us take a look at what the world will be like in the year 2000. And he made a number of guesses about what the future world would look like. And he did a great job. I would say he got a number of things right. He predicted, for example, very specifically that there will be more trains and more buses, which means that people will be able to move out of the cities and live in the suburbs, which has a dramatic impact on the way the city looks, on the way people behave. And he was absolutely right. Starting with, really, after World War II, we began to see the growth of suburbs, and the existence of mass transportation, as well as cars, was a big impact on that. He even predicted in 1901 that Germany's militarism, he identified it clearly as militarism, that the former Prussia, now become the modern state of Germany, would continue to press against the rest of the world. And he predicted not only essentially World War I, but also World War II, and said it would eventually be defeated, but at a high cost. I think that's an amazing prediction to make. He even said that eventually the European nations would all unite into a union. Evidently,